This morning, we're going to explore what it means to belong and how it is essential to our humanity and survival to belong somewhere and to something and to someone and to ourselves. Belonging is such an essential part of the human experience that we've even memorialized it as Unitarian Universalists in our 7th principle about the interconnected web. It's also underneath our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I'm also going to talk about the price of not belonging. For us in our everyday lives, but in the denial by larger society to groups when larger society says you do not belong and pushes them to the margins. And finally, how we can feel some increase in the feeling of belonging in our own lives, which I know has been harder since COVID. So I'll be leaning on the work in social science from the mystic Tokapa Turner and in the cry from justice from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. In case I forget to tell you later, there are 2 colored pictures of the memorial that I left over by the name tags, which you may decide you may or may not want to look at after the service. So, what is belonging? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you because it's a subjective experience. So each of you are going to have to define for yourselves what belonging means to you uniquely. But at its core, social belonging is always relational. Not just being with people, but being in relationship with people. In infancy, we are wired to connect to caretakers, and if we don't, we fail to thrive. It is through connection that one experiences positive self-regard. You can also belong to a geographical place. You can belong to ideas. You can also belong in a family of origin, in a community, in friendships, to your built family, and also in vocation, a calling for your work. And we also belong to the earth and we belong to the cosmos. But it is the relational piece that I want to focus on mostly this morning. What Brené Brown is talking about, a spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself, first of all, so that you can share an authentic core self, who you really are, what you really believe, when you go into community and into relationships. So true belonging does not require you to cut off part of who you are, part of your wholeness, in order to be accepted. And yet we all do that. We cut off part of our wholeness, and certain groups are required to do that more than others for simple survival and access into mainstream society. The myth of mainstream society, let me say that. If you want to know how vital belonging is across your lifespan, there is a book by the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, and I think it's titled Together, the Healing Power of Connection, where he's talking about loneliness. And in there, he's compiled a lot of research that shows that loneliness can put a person at as much risk physically as smoking. High blood pressure, heart disease, cognitive decline, and early death. So people who feel they belong through friendships and communities, relationships, they not only live longer, but they live healthier lives within those years. So we crave belonging because our brains are designed this way. Because as infants, we can't survive without it. And then we crave relationship across the lifespan. This drive can sometimes lead us into places where we think we might belong or might offer a false belonging, but we really don't truly fit in, We might join affinity groups, relationships, workspaces. Tokapah Turner says this leads to a diminished sense of a divided self. And while it gives the impression of belonging to something greater, there are hidden motives. There are rules about your behavior. And these places don't want your uniqueness. They want you to conform. So we become orphaned from the inalienable belonging when our gifts are not understood, when the system demands our loyalty but ignores our uniqueness, when intolerance makes people refugees, and when our culture forces us to split off what we are because we're told that that part is unwanted. For some groups who are othered because of ableism, color of skin, country of origin, sexual identity, age, and the list goes on, society pushes them away from belonging. And in many situations, this can become highly sadistic. So many people in our society have received toxic cultural messages about who is acceptable. This is demonstrated for others on a continuum from just criticism or scrutiny to terrorism and exile. There are two groups I want to make special mention of today: transgender people and people of color. Transgender people and people of color are especially vulnerable to violence and harassment, both emotionally and physically. It's my understanding from talking with all of you individually as couples and in small groups that UUFB has actually taken on educational efforts to better understand how transgender people are at critical risk to be victims of violence and how there is a much higher suicide rate because of the challenges for them. Kitty Donich and Ida Colleen have facilitated the multi-week group with UUA curriculum about how we can better understand the situation for transgender people and how we can be of support, how we can not other, to offer support and our time and belonging. So they've agreed to run the series again, so watch for signups. When I wrote the summary for this sermon, I said I was going to talk about the Legacy Museum and the Memorial for Peace and Justice. Those are actually both, they are connected. There is the museum about slavery to enslavement to mass incarceration, and then the memorial is kind of the outside piece. So I went to interim ministry training in Montgomery, Alabama. They had purposely put it in Montgomery, Alabama, because they wanted us to go to museums in the morning and have trainings in the afternoon. And for any of you who might have forgotten this, Montgomery, Alabama was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. But currently, there are more people of color in Montgomery than white people. So I was tremendously curious as a white person what it was going to be like to go there and not be part of the dominant group. How naive was that white people still weren't going to be the dominant group, even though they were smaller in number? I don't know what I was thinking. So tragically, most of Montgomery is arranged with the lie that white people are this dominant group. And this was in my face for the first 2 hours I was in Montgomery. The training hadn't started yet, so a couple of blocks down, I knew there was a river walk. So I walked underneath the train tracks through the tunnel. And you come out the other side on the river walk. It's a half a mile that runs along, the half a mile runs along the river. And there's these plaques that you can read as you go along. And there's mention of the river itself, of settlers, of the commerce of cotton, and interactions with Native American nations. However, there is no mention of slavery. Cotton is described as the great commerce, but no mention of the depraved commerce of the human trafficking of African Americans. 12 million African Americans, 2 million of which died on the voyage over. And we're thinking about belonging. So I was thinking, what is it like to be a person of color in Montgomery, Alabama, and having your history so hard to find from the casual walk? There were well over 4,000 African Americans who were lynched between 1870 and 1950. Yet the city of Montgomery made no mention of this in their public displays. The one timeline I found that mentioned Black leaders, after a lot about Hank Williams, mentioned that there had been a bus strike with Rosa Parks leading a protest about unfair practices. Somehow the brutality, the inequity, the Jim Crow laws, and the racial terror was left out of that whole painted piece about who was famous in Montgomery, Alabama. So as I walked around, the only historical markers I could actually find had been put up by private organizations. And that's what made the Legacy Museum and the memorial so important. So I went to the Civil Rights Museum. I went to the Rosa Parks Museum. I went to a presentation from the Initiative for Equity and Justice. And they are the people, Brian Stevenson's group, who wrote the book Just Mercy. And some of you may have seen the movie. So as I describe what it's like to go to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, I will warn you it takes some courage. And it requires you to trust the storyteller, that the storytellers will bring you back to the light. So I'm only the messenger. I'm not the storyteller. The storytellers are the families who lost these people. The storytellers are the families of those who are memorialized in Corton steel. And the memorial is terrifying, and yet it holds incredible beauty, in that the victims, their stories are finally not forgotten, and they're for all to see. As you come to the memorial, there's a beautiful flower garden. There are some sculptures on the campus, and then you go through a security system, which both saddened me and relieved me at the same time to know that no one could have weapons in the memorial or the museum. And the words that greet you are, "For the murdered, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember." With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. And with faith, because we shall overcome. So as you move up a little closer before you actually enter the square memorial, you realize that the memorial looks down upon the city of Montgomery. It looks down upon the Capitol building. It tells the story that the river boardwalk is too cruel and mean to tell. So the Legacy Museum and the Memorial opened in 2018, but the story that came before that was in 2010, the Equal Justice Initiative began investigating thousands of racial terror lynchings in the American South, some of which had never been documented. So the staff became witnesses to the connections between Southern racial history and the modern day injustice of mass incarceration, as well as the link between lynching and the current death penalty, and the connection between the current presumptions of guilt for people of color, no presumption of innocence, They spent 5 years looking through newspaper archives, they visited communities, they interviewed people. They documented over 4,000 victims of racial terror lynching between 1870 and 1950. They have continued on since 1950, of course, but that's not part of the memorial. And they found the story, they heard the stories of these Black communities forced to witness brutal killings of friends or relatives by bold mobs, and they were warned that the same fate awaited them if they sought justice or if they even spoke about what had happened. These people were killed without any trial, often for social infractions. Perceived social infractions. So after they issued a report in 2015, they received hundreds of calls and letters and emails started pouring in. People said, there are more stories. Please come. Please hear our story. And so they did. They also erected historical markers where none had existed before. So the memorial now exists to honor those who do the work and for those who have died. So it's built in a square with a somewhat hollow center, and I don't want to tell you about what's in the center until the end. But as you enter the monuments, these are made of corten steel, and they're a little wider than the pulpit, but not much, and they're about 8 feet tall. So you enter on the first level, and they're at eye level. So each memorial is a county, and then it has usually many names for the victims of the lynchings in that county. And most of us ran our fingers across the names. We tried even to remember a few of the names, but as you go on, it becomes an impossible task. And then you move to the next corner and you do the 90-degree turn. And in the next corner, the monuments have moved up. So they're no longer on your eye level, they're moving up. And as they begin to rise, you descend, and natural light starts to be restricted to you. And there's this little faint gurgling of water. And I thought, oh, it rained last night and it rained this morning, so that must just be some drainage going on. I continued to read names. I continued to put my hands along the monuments. I saw so many other people doing the same. I saw African American families sometimes doing rubbings off of the memorials. So by this time, my heart is breaking. Sometimes they just have to take in air. And then you're asked to take the third turn. And I realized at that moment, not only are the memorials going up a bit, but I am descending. And the descent seems like it's getting steeper. And it feels like this is the descent into hell. How much more can the heart take? But I feel like this is asked of me. So I go on, and the water is louder. And what I come to think about with all that water is the tears of the people, the families left behind, the friends, entire communities. And by that time, there are no words. So the last corridor tells the story of more than 90 Black men, women, and children killed for alleged social transgressions. So no criminal activity alleged whatsoever. The water wall bears the inscription that invites us to remember the thousands of victims whose names will never be known. So just as your heart can take no more, and your mind can make no sense of what you are seeing, because how could anything so horrible exist? A pathway appears and it invites you up into the light. It invites you up into the middle of the structure. What the creators ask you for in the light is to take your grief and your outrage and to put it to use. They ask you to tell actual stories of what happened for those listed, and to support efforts at truth-telling and reparation, to listen to the lived experiences of Black people, both in their history and what they are experiencing right here today, and to work against mass incarceration. People of color have done amazing work in trying to tell the story of what happened to African Americans and also the genocide of Native Americans. But they need white allies to help them in that journey, in that work. So where do we go with this? I know I've taken you to a place that's very, very hard to be. I would suggest you think about belonging to yourself and belonging to others in relational space, and think about those that have been marginalized and terrorized. And when we think about that, it's a process. It's not as though we arrive with answers. It's not as though we arrive at a healing. It's a process. We can't just finish it and move on. So for yourself, start to notice in the next few weeks when you have yearnings to be accepted in community. And notice that belonging always begins with extending an invitation. When a person extends an invitation to us, we feel included, we feel welcomed. It's a portal to our belonging. But some of us will shy away. We won't believe we're worthy. We know there's risk in that invitation. What if we respond and we're not found acceptable? What if our needs don't get met? When we're the ones to extend the invitation, we desire for the other person to feel welcomed, to feel included, to be truly seen. And the greatest gift we can provide here as a community is to be a welcoming presence to others without trying to control or fix or ask something of them. That's what the sermon about widening the circle last week was about. How do we be the most welcoming we can be? And how do we get outside what we define as our community of normal? How do we make room for more? And for the work of offering belonging to marginalized groups, that begins in the heart. And it begins with courage. It begins by starting to explore your biases that I will tell you, most of us don't think we have, but we do. How we look at groups who might look or act differently than us. What are our fears about that? Do not ask marginalized people to cut off pieces of who they are to fit into your image of them. And again, I think we do that sometimes unconsciously because our society does it and we just absorb it. We don't mean to, it's not our intention. In the next few months, I'm going to facilitate a couple of book groups about the book Caste, which was written by Isabel Wilkerson, who I believe is a professor at Harvard and a researcher, of course. It's not easy reading. This book compares the caste system of India to Nazi Germany's genocidal work, to the caste system in America since 1619, the year we started to kidnap and enslave Africans. It invites us to do the equity and the human rights work that needs to continue in this country. And it really, in a lot of ways, that book emboldens people. So there'll be a lot to think about in the next few weeks and months. I'm going to leave you with the words of Unitarian Universalist Minister Rebecca Parker. No matter how weak or how frightened we may feel, we each have gifts that can make a difference in the world. In this coming week, may you do at least one thing to support the broken, to welcome the stranger, to celebrate what is worthy, and to do the work of justice and love. Be strong, be connected. Each day act so that you will feel and be a little more whole. Blessed be.